Hey guys, it's Miss Sinclair with AP World History Unit 7. Today we are going to be talking about what's been going on in East Asia between 1931 and 1945. So we talked about the rise of fascism. After this, we'll start talking about World War II, but lots of things are happening simultaneously. So I want you to think back. What are the characteristics of fascism? What are the things we would expect to see from a fascist leader? So use these as a self-assessment tool, as always. So East Asia, this aligns with our Unit 7 topics. We're going to start talking about warfare and economic crises. It all relates. So your objective, you will be able to describe the Second Sino-Japanese War. Remember, Sino means Chinese. So we've talked about the rise of fascism in Europe, but what about Japan? So remember, quick review of Japanese history. We had Japanese isolationism for a long time during the Tokugawa shogunate. Then, after Commodore Matthew Perry forced them open, we had a Meiji restoration where they industrialized rapidly, where they renewed their position on the global stage. They participated in World War I. They were snubbed in the Paris Peace Accords, and they realized that they need more resources. So as they industrialize, they need more resources. They were impacted by the Great Depression as well, and they looked and saw how Britain and France were able to weather the recession because they could rely on their colonies. So you have this rising tradition of militarism in Japan. Military training is required for all males beyond elementary grades. This includes local training units for those who did not continue their education. And the civilian government really had no control over the military. So as the Japanese state industrialized, we see that a big part of that process was the modernization of the military, bringing in Western American, German, British military leaders. If you remember, they wanted an army like Prussia, a navy like Britain. They wanted to be on the cutting edge. So during the global Great Depression, the exports coming out of Japan dropped by half. The collapse of demand for silk and rice will ruin thousands of Japanese farmers. To survive, many sold their daughters into prostitution, and their sons joined the military. So, the Meiji Restoration, who was Emperor Meiji, right? He is going to be really revered in Japan. In fact, after his death, he is going to be deified, viewed as a god. There will be a shrine to him. So it's important to understand that the emperor is really respected and admired. It was the emperor who had the vision to modernize Japan and bring them this power and influence. So the emperor and the military are very highly respected and revered. Ultranationalists really resented that Japan is dependent on foreign trade. If only they had a colonial empire. They really are going to admire the fascist governments in Italy and Germany. And they start to talk about China. China's so weak. China has all these resources. China is just there, waiting to be taken. So this narrative in Japan begins of, if only we had colonies, Europe doesn't respect us anyway, right? We saw that in the Paris Peace Accords. We need more resources. We need colonies. We need to conquer China. It would solve so many of Japan's problems. So let's compare Japanese fascism to European fascism. So Japan's not going to have a dictator until after the outbreak of World War II in the Pacific. So Mussolini, Hitler, dictators from the get-go. Prior to that point, Japan will be ruled by a coalition of military and compliant civilian leadership. In Japan as well, you're not going to have any scapegoat group like you'll have in Europe, right? It's all the Jews' fault. If the Jews hadn't sabotaged Germany, then they would have won World War I. You don't really have that in Japan. However, you will see that the Koreans are going to be treated very badly. And in general, the Japanese will see themselves as superior to everyone else. So they are going to be very abusive and violent towards those they conquer in Japan, China, Malaysia. Just the stories you hear coming out of the Japanese conquest are just horrific. You don't have any prominent private brainwashed army, right? So you had Mussolini's brown shirts, Hitler's stormtroopers. Yes, that's where the Star Wars characters are named after. Chiang Kaishek's blue shirts. So these are private armies who are really dedicated, devoted to their leader, right? And then there's the rest of the army as well. But in Japan, you don't have this sort of private unit within the greater military. However, we do have lots of similarities. Thought control and police terror were prominent, right? There's only one way to live and act, and there's a proper way to be Japanese and an improper way. But the emperor will continue to be revered, and just like in Germany, right, the school children, the youths will be indoctrinated about Japanese nationalism. Just like in Germany and in Italy, we will see extreme nationalism and militarism, right? Those two things led to the outbreak of World War I as well. And you will see an aggressive foreign policy. So, what starts all of this? It's known as the Manchurian Incident in 1931. Basically, in the 1920s, Chiang Kaishek of the Kuomintang, right, the nationalists in China, will be able to be dominant over the warlords in China. So the success of the Kuomintang in China is worrisome for Japan, right? Japan's worst nightmare is that China would be able to get its act together, that they would be able to become industrialized, economically dominant. This would mean that China would be the dominant power in East Asia instead of Japan. So Japan will seize control of Manchuria. Manchuria, we know it's in northeastern China. It was rich with coal and iron ore, two things Japan needed for its industry. And they are going to declare that it is an independent state of Manchukuo. So junior officers will take over the rest of Manchuria. And basically, the government in Japan will acquiesce to save face. So let me rephrase that. Basically, some junior officers, not the leadership, just some young guys, conquered Manchuria beyond just this little bit on the coastline. And the Japanese government's like, yeah, I mean, we approve that. Yeah, we definitely approve that. This wasn't people acting on their own, right? So they claimed all of Manchuria as a way to save face, because it'd be embarrassing for the civilian government to admit that they can't control the military. So it is at this point we have a shift to military control of the government until 1945. And this really serves as the beginning of World War II in Asia. So the United States and the League of Nations condemn this action. Japan, you shouldn't have done that. That was very bad. Please withdraw your troops. And Japan's like, no, we're not doing that. Just like with Ethiopia, the League of Nations is like, well, we still disagree. We're going to write you a strongly worded letter. This also will create some buffer between the Soviet Union and Japan. Manchuria is rich in coal and iron deposits, and Japan is resource poor. This is something that is always going to be a problem for Japan. It's a bunch of islands in the north. So here is Manchuria. They had already conquered Korea in the first Sino-Japanese War, if you remember. So it is during this time that Japan will really begin to arm itself. They will build up railways and factories. They will build up their military, and the government will grow more authoritarian, jailing thousands of critics. So I want you guys to take a moment, pause the video, and consider what were the economic reasons behind Japan's invasion of Manchuria. But let's talk about what's going on in China. So Mao Zedong is going to be the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao Zedong is a farmer's son, and he left home to study philosophy. He is not, though, a peaceful philosopher. He is a man of action, specifically violence. He's not afraid to get his hands dirty. And in the 1920s, he will discover Karl Marx. So Mao's communism is going to be a little bit different from some of the other things we've seen. Marx and Lenin viewed peasants as backwards and hopeless, and they put their hope in industrial workers. Mao is going to be building off of the ideas of Li Dezhou, right? We talked about him before. Last time we talked about China. And Mao is going to believe in a revolution from the ground up. You start the revolution by redistributing the land to peasants. He's going to advocate for women's equality. Divorce is okay, no more arranged marriages, no more foot binding. Yes, that's still happening in China. So this is a big deal because China, Japan, East Asia in general is still super patriarchal, super following that Confucian tradition of filial piety. So this is one way that Mao is really breaking with Chinese tradition. So he is going to end up leading the communists on what's known as the Long March. But first, he has to combat the nationalists. So, in the 1920s, Mao Zedong discovers communism and is a big part of the Chinese Communist Party. He starts getting followers. Well, Chiang Kaishek of the Kuomintang doesn't want this kind of opposite group, right? The Kuomintang is nationalists. Nationalists hated communists. So, in 1927, the Kuomintang attacks the communists. He is going to push the communists back into the mountains. So he attacks them in Shanghai, and this really starts a civil war in China. Chiang Kai-shek will really capture areas in the Yangtze River Valley. He's going to capture Shanghai, Beijing, the Huanghe River Valley. The communists will use guerrilla warfare to fight back. And from the get-go, we see a large division in the nationalists versus the communists, right? The nationalists are more focused on the upper classes, the coasts, the big cities. The government soldiers will really mistreat the peasants, whereas the communists will help the peasants. They will pay a fair price for food and supplies. They will treat the women with respect, whereas the nationalist, the Kuomintang soldiers, are just stealing food. They are raping women. It's terrible, right? So they were pushed out of Shanghai and then forced into the mountains where they're trapped, right? Here they are, trapped in the mountains. Well, they decide to break out and go to Shanxi, a remote province, to regroup. It's known as the Long March. It's a 6,000-mile flight of Chinese communists from southeastern China to northwestern China. 90,000 communists in the Chinese Red Army will march thousands of miles to escape the Kuomintang. Only 4,000 will really make it to Shanxi alive. They're going to be using dilapidated wooden rifles, if they were armed at all, to defend against the nationalist machine guns and foreign supplied arsenal. So the United States military was helping to supply Chiang Kaishek. During this trek, Mao Zedong is really going to be solidifying his position in the Communist Party leadership, and he's going to gain a lot of followers. Chiang Kai-shek really figures that he's gotten rid of the communists. He has them beat. Well, in many ways, this tension in China between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party is going to remain. But in some ways, it's going to be put on hold until after the Japanese occupation. So if you look at this map up here, during the 1920s, Chiang Kai-shek is really able to solidify his hold, right? He takes control over the warlords. He takes control of the communists. So other than this like one isolated area, the nationalists, the Kuomintang, are governing all of China. And then Japan invades. The Japanese leadership is kind of unsure what to do. How much further do we want to take this? And once again, the junior officers take charge, right? They figured we weren't punished last time we invaded and expanded. So in 1937, Japan will invade China from Manchuria with plans to conquer all of China. They're very successful at first, occupying most of Chinese coastal cities, Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai. The Japanese Navy will blockade the entire coast of China. So the only way that China is getting any aid from the US, from Europe, from anyone is going to be through Myanmar. So you see right here. So Myanmar, Burma at the time, Rangoon, right, is being, actually, let me go, here you go, is occupied by the British. So they are able to get access into China through Burma because all of this is being occupied and controlled by the Japanese. So China's basically trapped. The League of Nations, once again, condemns Japanese aggression. Hey, you shouldn't have done that. We told you not to do that. But frankly, Western powers are more concerned with Hitler than Japan at this point. Remember, they're still pretty racist. They don't really care about Asia, apart from how Asia can benefit them. So when the Japanese Navy even attacks a US and British ship, they just protest. So why did you attack our ship? And Japan's like, oh, our bad. It was an accident. We didn't know. And they're like, okay, well, pay us for the damages. And that's it, right? Japan really doesn't want the United States involved in this war. So the Chinese army is very brave, but they lose every battle. They are poorly led. They are badly armed. The Japanese Air Force bombs cities way before the army actually gets there. And so they're firebombing these cities. They are utterly destroyed. The Japanese soldiers will break down dams, so they flood valleys. They will burn villages. They will kill thousands of civilians. Look at that picture. What is laying in that ditch? It's bodies. It's just full of bodies. So, in many ways, Chinese conquest is going to be kind of disappointing. For one thing, the Chinese continue to resist, either through the Kuomintang, like the official army, or through communist guerrilla forces. Japan kind of thought they would get in, they'd conquer the big cities, and then China would just surrender. They would just give in and be like, oh, okay, I guess we're conquered now. No, it turns out the Chinese continue to fight back, tooth and nail, day in, day out. The communists and nationalists allied during World War II to fight back the Japanese, right? Who's going to govern China is not really an issue if the answer right now is Japan. And Japan is kind of unsure of how to proceed. Life in Japan is getting harsher and more repressive. Taxes are rising. Food and fuel are starting to get scarce. All the young men are drafted. And in their conquered lands, Japan is just brutal, right? They're getting ready to behead this young Chinese soldier. So, warfare between China and Japan. It is so incredibly violent. Recently, I was listening to an audiobook called, what was it called? The Flying Tigers, I think. It was about some American pilots who were working for the Kuomintang to serve as basically China's Air Force to fight back the Japanese. And they described the rape of Nanking. And I was sitting in the car listening to it with my husband. We were on a road trip, and we almost had to turn it off. It was just so sickening to me. So, Japanese forces will take the city of Nanking and will kill between 150 to 400,000 people, prisoners and civilians. They will rape 20,000 women. The studies into this show that the Japanese very specifically used sexual torture of women. They will be completely without mercy. They will loot and burn the city. The phrase that will be used is kill all, burn all, loot all. So I'm going to read a quote to you guys. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East estimated that 20,000 women, including some children and the elderly, were raped during the occupation. A large number of the rapes were done systematically by the Japanese soldiers as they went from door to door, searching for girls, with many women being captured and gang raped. The women were often killed immediately after being raped, often through explicit mutilation or penetration by bayonets, long sticks of bamboo, or other objects, including fireworks. Young children were not exempt from these atrocities and were cut open to allow Japanese soldiers to rape them. It's so utterly horrific. And unfortunately, this is not going to be limited to just one city. This is going to be common everywhere Japan conquers. Korea, China, Malaysia, the Philippines. It is utterly terrible. I've just barely scratched the surface. Don't worry, I'm not going to read anymore. I'm not going to tell you anymore. Japan denies they did any of that stuff, by the way. So, how do you stop them? Well, Chiang Kaishek is going to be kind of at the end of his rope. Like, the nationalist government is unable to stop the Japanese from doing all of this. So he decides my best bet is going to be to blow the dikes on the Yellow River. Maybe I can flood them out and kill the soldiers. Instead, he mostly just kills his own people. The flood destroys 4,000 villagers, kills almost 1 million, about 900,000, and will make 12.5 million people homeless, right? So Chiang Kai-shek just made the situation so much worse. Not only did he not get rid of the Japanese military, he just made 12 million of his own citizens refugees. So he flees and sets up sort of his government in the mountains of the Sichuan province. He built up a huge army to fight the communists in the future, but also the Japanese now. He will draft 3 million men, but only will have 1 million rifles, so he's unable to supply or arm his soldiers. So to pay for all of this, to buy more weapons from the West, he will raise taxes on the farmers. Even during a famine, he doesn't tax his wealthy urban supporters. He taxes the poor. He prints more money to try and do this. All this does is create inflation. There's a problem of hoarding of wealth. And in general, the nationalists tend to be super corrupt. So what about Mao Zedong and the communists? Well, they have also fled and set up an army. They are set up here in the Northwest. So you can see blue, occupied by the Japanese, green, the nationalists, red, the communists. So he's going to set up his own government as well. And in the territory that they occupy, they will take the land from the wealthy and redistribute it to the poor. They listen to the grievances of the peasants. He has rigid discipline on his soldiers. No dissent or criticism is allowed. He will have few weapons as well, but he gets support and intelligence from the farmers. So the peasants like him. They respect him. They feel abused by the Kuomintang, but the communists care for them. They give them food when they have food. They give them land. They listen to them. So when a Chinese farmer sees that the Japanese army is shifting their soldiers from one place to another, they tell the communists, so then the communist army can fight back effectively. They will use military defeats as propaganda victories. So even after the Japanese are forced to withdraw from China, the civil war between the Kuomintang and the communists will continue. It will go on until 1949. The message of the communists will gain support with the peasants. So, how did the conflict between Japan and China have an impact on the government? How did it have an impact on the civilians? So, this is a great crash course. It will talk about China's revolutions. We don't need to go on to talk about the Cultural Revolution and the way that the communist government starts to assert itself after 1950. But we're just going to pause on China for there and think about the final steps, the final dominoes that need to fall for us to go to war. So we see lots of use of propaganda throughout this war. Propaganda is going to be government's use of a variety of strategies, including speeches, music, and art to mobilize population during war times. Hitler's goals are not prosperity or even popularity. It's conquest. He builds up his armed forces as soon as he takes power. So, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party wants to eventually invade and destroy the Communist Union to attack the communist threat. Remember, the Soviet Union is the largest communist state in Europe, and nationalists and communists hate each other. So, in 1933, Hitler sets up a totalitarian state. He withdraws from the League of Nations. Then, in 1935, he rearms Germany, ignoring the Treaty of Versailles. Great Britain and France see this, but they don't want to risk war by standing up to Germany, so they just let it happen. Meanwhile, emboldened Italy invades Ethiopia, who had been the last free state in Africa and a member of the League of Nations. In 1936, Hitler sends troops into the Rhineland to start setting up his military. So the Rhineland is the area on the border between Belgium and France, right in there. Everyone protests but doesn't do anything. In 1938, he invades Austria, and the Austrians just accept that. They surrender instantly. It's Anschluss. It's this unification with Austria. There's shared language here. There's shared culture. Then he annexes the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. Now, this will lead to a policy of appeasement. At the Munich conference, they will start this policy of appeasement. Basically, Great Britain and France will have Germany promise not to take any more land. So, they let him have the German parts of Czechoslovakia without consulting the Czechs, as long as he promises to stop. Isolationist countries like the United States, Great Britain, and France were willing to sacrifice small states like Austria and Czechoslovakia to avoid war. So why? I mean, all that appeasement does is teach Hitler that aggression works, that no one's going to stop him, that he can do whatever he wants. So why practice appeasement? I mean, hindsight's 2020. You look back and think what did they think was going to happen? Well, you have to understand exactly how scarring World War I was, how utterly horrific. So everyone in positions of leadership in the militaries of Great Britain, France, and the United States fought in World War I and are deeply scarred by it. Similarly, the civilian populations in these countries are scarred by World War I. They don't want another war. They desperately want to avoid a repeat of World War I. Unlike dictators, politicians in democracies could not ignore their constituents' desire for peace. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to go to war instantly, but he couldn't because Congress was so isolationist. There was a fear of communism among conservatives. People were more scared of Stalin than they were of Hitler. So Hitler at least claimed to respect Christianity and private property, and he seemed like he might be strong enough to hold back the Soviet Union. Also, just the novelty of fascist leaders, right? Great Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, assumed that the political leaders were honorable and that an agreement was just as valid as a business contract. He believed Hitler's promises. So, pause, look at this political cartoon. First of all, do you see who drew it? Can you tell from the art style? I'll give you a hint. He signed his name at the bottom. Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss is going to create a lot of World War II propaganda. Some of it's going to be super racist. So remember, one more lollipop, then you can all go home. The little man in the center there, it says appeasement. And then, of course, all of the monsters around him have the swastika on it. So what do you think is the message of this cartoon? What country do you think was drawing it? What do you think is the perspective of Dr. Seuss here? So these kinds of political cartoons are primary sources that you should be able to analyze as well. What about this one? What does it say? Do you recognize their faces? Can you tell who they're representing? Spineless leaders of democracy. Can you read what these say? So, we're going to war. In 1939, Hitler invades all of Czechoslovakia. All right, he took part of it and they said, please stop. But that's all they did. So he just takes all of it. Great Britain and France realized they can't trust Hitler, so they asked the Soviet Union for help to step in against him. Stalin, though, doesn't trust the capitalists. So he cuts a deal. Hitler offers a deal to Stalin, and Stalin takes it. Hitler offers to split Poland, and Stalin agrees. So you have the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. It's a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. This solves one of the problems from World War I. Right? Germany had to deal with a two-front war in World War I, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Not anymore. Now Hitler doesn't have to worry about a two-front war. And Stalin begins building up his armies. So, what about this political cartoon? Scum of the earth, I believe. The bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. What is it saying? What's the message? So on September 1st, 1939, Hitler attacks Poland, and this is the end of peace. This is the official start of World War II. So, how did fascism in Italy and Germany lead to World War II? Pause and discuss. Ask yourself, can I answer this? Can I vaguely answer this, or can I actually answer this using facts? And then for your summary, I would like you to identify and explain Japan's road to fascism, and then describe the Second Sino-Japanese War. Thanks, guys. Next, we'll be talking about World War II itself. We only have 2 more lectures in Unit 7, and then we'll start Unit 8 and 9. Remember, there is a specific World War II Unit 7 video playlist. But in general, we have our Unit 7 video playlist with a variety of videos to help you understand this content. I suggest you check them out. There's way too much content here for us to show them in class, but you should really watch them to have your own understanding increased. Thanks for listening.